these people.
Buddy.
Hello, everyone. This is a special clip of INN News. I am Collin Radix-Carter with my co-host, Reef Breland. How you doing, Reef?
All right.
And we have a special guest. We are very excited to have Miko Peled join us. Miko is, for many of you know, he's an Israeli-American activist, author, karate instructor, author of the book, The General's Son, and a journey of an Israeli in Palestine and injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. So Miko, very excited. I've been looking forward to having you. So it's a pleasure having you on the show.
My pleasure.
So thank you so much again for being willing to come on. I reached out to you because you wrote an article in the press, I think a few weeks ago, regarding Israel and its quote unquote democraticness. So you had some arguments about that. But before we start, since I think a lot of our audience may not know who you are, if you can just kind of share a little bit more about you and like just kind of give us the origin story as to who you are and
Sure.
What was the catalyst that drove you into activism, especially for Palestinians.
So let me read something to you, okay? Because I tweeted something about 48 hours ago. I posted something on Twitter about 48 hours ago. It's got over 600,000 views in about 48 hours, which is a record. Even I think for me, it's some kind of a record, and it encapsulates. It's the answer to your question, who I am. And the tweet goes like this, and I'm happy people keep sharing it, and people did screenshots and they posted on other platforms. So I was raised in Jerusalem, in a very Zionist patriotic family. And that family included a grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence, a great uncle who was the president of the state of Israel, my father who was a general in the Israeli army. And that's just a few of many, many members of my family who were part of who held important positions in the establishment of the state of Israel. So I grew up in this very, very patriotic Zionist family. And the end of this post, the end of this tweet, I say that I can state without hesitation, Israel was never a democracy, nor was it ever intended to be one. And I guess that spoke to a lot of people. Like I said, it's got almost 250,000 views in about 48 hours. So that's my background. I come from that unique background. As the title or the subtitle of my book, which is right here, suggests, it's The General's Son, the journey of an Israeli in Palestine. And so I embarked on a journey into Palestine and began about 25 years ago and began meeting Palestinians. So even though I was born and raised in Jerusalem, growing up, I never met Palestinians. It's a completely segregated country. It's a completely, the two societies are completely segregated and they never meet anywhere. Even kids never have any activities, even in a city like Jerusalem, which is, quote unquote, mixed city. But then I began to meet Palestinians. I began to venture into Palestinian cities, to drive on my own to the West Bank and other areas that are predominantly Palestinians within the country. And then gradually realized that I was an Israeli who was born and raised in Palestine. And this whole notion of an Israel as a legitimate political entity is a myth. Israel is just another name of the brutal occupation and an apartheid regime that has taken over Palestine and has been, in place for 75 years.
Well, that brings us to our first question we had for you, which you just touched on. You said, I can state without hesitation, Israel was never a democracy, nor is it ever intended to be. Can you elaborate on why you feel like Israel's not a democracy for the people
Sure.
who don't know?
Sure. There's several things. First of all, the idea of establishing a state for Jewish people in an Arab country already contradicts the idea of a democracy. Palestine is an Arab country. It's been an Arab country going back a very long time. It's an Arab country. The idea of bringing European Jews, or Jews from anywhere for that matter, to colonize it and establishing a state only for them not for everybody else. Spelling a Jewish state in an Arab country is already inherently undemocratic. Now, once they were able to establish, they were only able to establish the state, the Jewish state, after a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing that included horrific massacres and death marches and so on. I mean, there's plenty of literature and documentation of what the Zionist militia and the Israeli army have done to Palestinians. And that was how they were able to establish a state for Jews only. Now, the Palestinians who ended up living in part of that state, who remained, lived under military occupation. It was like about 1948. And then when that military occupation was lifted, then Israel established a system of laws that specifically discriminated against that population. So my citizenship as an Israeli Jewish person, and the citizenship and the laws and the realities under which a Palestinian who has the same cards, it looks the same, the citizenship card, is completely different. It's completely set of laws, completely different reality, completely set of rules. Now, on top of that, later on, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the people in that there have no right to even vote. I mean, they have no citizenship, no rights, no legal status at all that provides them any rights. Now, when I'm within the state of Israel,
mm-hmm.
The laws protect me. I live as an Israeli Jew. The state of Israel treats me just like any other liberal democracy would treat a citizen. But if I was a Palestinian, I'd be living under a completely different set of laws and different set of rules. So, for example, there's an Israeli settler who was accused of murdering a Palestinian a few days ago. Mm-hmm. He went to civilian court and was released. There are Palestinians who are accused of all kinds of different things all the time. They're sent to a military court. So when you have a government that legally, systemically, and systematically provides privilege to one particular population and discriminates against another part of the population, and it does it with laws. In other words, this is all anchored in law. That is apartheid. That cannot be a democracy. When you do not have equal rights, then you are not a democracy. That's it. That's just the way it is. So Israel likes to say that it's a democracy. American politicians love, for some reason, to keep saying that Israel is a democracy. But Israel not only is not a democracy, it wasn't intended to be a democracy. It was intended to be a democracy for Jewish people, which is a completely different thing,
right,
than being a democracy.
Which kind of speaks into, it's interesting you kind of phrase it in this way, the white privilege that you mentioned in your article. So for you, how do you not resonate, that's probably not the right word, but how do you struggle with that in terms of, obviously you speak to the privilege that you have, but knowing the reality of what the Palestinians are going through in light of Zionism. So actually, I wanted to ask you, and I just feel, especially in the space, when we talk, I think there's a lack of discussion regarding Zionism in general. I think oftentimes it does kind of conflate with anti-Semitism at times. So what is Zionism, and why is this ideology significant in terms of what you just described in the article, in terms of the white privilege that is that you have seen and you kind of admitted to in terms of your experience, and also you as a white Israeli?
So let me start by saying this. Zionism is a racist supremacist ideology that claims that I have rights in Palestine that Palestinians do not, or at the expense of Palestinians. It's a racist ideology, pure and simple. There can be no compromise. There can be no discussion on it. It is a purely racist, supremacist ideology. Anti-Semitism is also, racism. It is being anti-Semitic, of course, racist.
Right.
So Zionism and anti-Semitism and all the forms of racism, of course, need to be rejected, and there should be zero tolerance for any of them, regardless of what the title of the specific form of racism is. There should be zero tolerance. If we want to make sure there's no anti-Semitism, if we feel very strongly, as some American politicians like to say, elected officials, oh, we have to fight anti-Semitism, we have a problem, that's great. It means we have to teach tolerance. We have to make sure that we educate, that we teach tolerance. And tolerance is a major part of an education system, that it's a major part of our culture. Tolerance for everyone. The idea that the answer to anti-Semitism is racism against somebody else and creating a place where there's this Jewish supremacy, so to speak, is absurd. If that's the answer to anti-Semitism, they like to say that Israel is the answer to the Holocaust. Excuse me? Racism and violence by Jews against somebody else is the answer to the Holocaust. What kind of an answer is that? We're only creating more hatred, more violence, more suffering. It's absurd. Nobody can, there's nobody in the right mind can accept this unless they buy into and accept the racism.
Right.
So supporting Zionism is being racist. Opposing Zionism is just like opposing any other form of racism. It's the absolute right thing to do. Now, the Zionists, from very early on, before the state of Israel, were aware that this was a problem. And conflating anti-Semitism with rejection of Zionism was a big part of their campaigning from very early on.
Mm.
If you reject the idea of Zionism, you are an anti-Semite, which is, of course, absurd because, especially in the early days, but even today, there are many Jewish people who reject Zionism. There are many Jewish people who do not accept this racist supremacist ideology. So it's always been absurd, but they know it, so they push it very, very hard. And here in America, particularly, they've been very, very successful. So when an American politician wants to defend themselves against accusations of anti-Semitism, they don't say, I believe in tolerance for everyone. What do they say? I'm the biggest supporter of Israel.
Right.
You're a biggest supporter of Israel, then you're even more of a racist than we thought you were to begin with. That shouldn't be the answer. Supporting Israel should be something that is completely unacceptable to people who care about racism.
So let me ask you this then. Why do you think there aren't people like you who are speaking out, like in terms of, the illegal occupation that is Israel? Like,
well, there are people who speak, but they're not enough. And the problem is the Zionist organizations have been, people talk about the Israeli lobby. They think of, a bunch of people with suits and ties or whatever up at the Capitol Hill, lobbying. The Zionist lobby existed long before the state of Israel was established, at least 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It started even actually more than 100 years. And they knew that they needed to influence not just politicians. They needed to have a hand in education systems, in culture, in media, in philanthropy, and of course in politics. And they did a remarkable job. I mean, there are NGOs here in America whose sole objective is to take a look at social studies textbooks in middle school and make sure the students are learning about Israel-Palestine the way the Zionists want them to learn about it.
Right.
And they provide teachers with curricula, and they provide teachers with, material and, all this fancy stuff for free. And when teachers go and take these courses from these Zionist organizations, they get continuing education units. So they're very, very, and they understood also very, very early on that not only in America, but particularly in America, all politics is local. So you've got to start local. So somebody running for school board or city council of a small city will get a free trip to Israel and will get all the information, all the indoctrination about Israel. So they're very thorough. So the competition that we have as people of conscience, people who care about justice for Palestine, is enormous. And we don't have the resources, and we don't have the, the loudspeakers and the cameras that they do. So it's a very difficult uphill battle.
Right.
Yeah.
So ideally, what would you like to see, or what should be happening that can kind of counter the Zionist narrative? I think maybe thinking in terms of maybe our audience, I think especially the good thing is, I think the idea of more of a pro-Palestine sentiment, I think, is growing. I think for just slowly. And I think more people are becoming a lot more aware of, I wouldn't say it's a conflict of Israelis and Palestinians per se, but I think there is definitely a more pro and Palestinian sentiment, right now, which I think we definitely want to kind of grow. But as you said, like resources are not necessarily there to kind of counter the Zionist lobby. Like, what in your mind should happen to kind of increase that awareness and kind of increase this narrative of what you describe in terms of the needs of Palestine, and to kind of counter those Zionist plans, basically.
So the bigger problem is that the Palestinian issue does not have a parent. The South African, during the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, you had the ANC, and you had the South African Communist Party, and you had the entire Soviet bloc, Eastern Bloc, that was very heavily supporting the anti-apartheid movement. Without Cuba's intervention in Angola, apartheid may not have fallen. So Cuba had a major role. Palestine does not have that. Israel was very smart in dismantling any power, any source, any power source, if you will, that was pro-Palestinian and could support the Palestinian cause. So if we look at the Middle East, if we look at the Arab countries, who are the countries that were supporting the Palestinian cause? And think about each one of these countries and what they faced: Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria. What happened to these countries? As opposed to the Arab countries who do not give that kind of support to the Palestinians and are willing to normalize with Israel and have good relations with America, and they're doing fine. And then if we look around the world beyond the Middle East, African countries were very supportive of the Palestinian cause. Israel has been working tirelessly. Israel even has an observer status in the African Union. Now the African Union they want to kick them out, but it's not that easy. Israel is inside and has relations with African countries, even African countries that are majority Muslim, that you'd think would tend more to support the Palestinian cause, because Israel is destroying Islam in Palestine. Israel is destroying Muslim sites. Some of the most important Muslim sites in the world exist in Palestine, and Israel is taking over and destroying them. So you think there was the sympathy, but in every single country, same thing in Latin America, same thing in Indonesia, Malaysia, even Pakistan, Israel is pushing very, very hard to gain influence in these countries and to push for normalization. On top of that, the Biden administration just appointed a full ambassador for the role of pushing forward what they call the Abraham Accords, normalize the accords whereby countries that did not have relations with Israel normalized with relations with Israel. So now it's a full ambassador. I don't know why the American people have to pay for an ambassador to convince countries that don't want to normalize relations with Israel to have good relations. Why is it an American problem? Why do Americans have to pay for this? Why do Americans have to worry about this?
Biden resources are at play.
Nominated a full ambassador for this. It's absurd. So that's what we're facing now. That's the reality now. So the Palestinian issue has no parent. There's no group, no organization, no country that is behind the Palestinian cause, calling for a free and democratic Palestine over all of historic Palestine, clearly rejecting Zionism, clearly rejecting the state of Israel. There's nobody doing that. So without that, without countering, having somebody counter these enormous efforts by Israel and the United States, the Palestinian cause is disappearing. I mean, in Washington, D.C., that you won't find a single Palestinian flag In Washington, D.C., you will not find a single Palestinian flag. That means there is no Palestine.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why.
Is that why you think that, like, it feels like Israeli propaganda seems to run rampant and every politician seems to get hooked on it? Biden has to say on campaign trail that he's a Zionist outright, right? You have people like RFK who have to, say things like the Jenin bombing myth. Why do you think their propaganda works so well? Is my question.
They're very good at it. They've been doing it for a long time and they have all the resources. That's why they're so good. But what happened, if we take RFK as an example, and I've been meeting with people who volunteered to work in his campaign because they believed in him. And are just completely disillusioned now because of his statements on Israel. Now, he was accused for all kinds of reasons of anti-Semitism. I won't get into that.
Yep.
Right.
So his response was not to stand up and say, look, I believe in tolerance. I'm not a racist. I do not believe in anti-Semitism. I do not support any form of racism, and so on and so forth. No, what did he say? He said, I am the biggest champion of the state of Israel. And he went and sat down with one of the nastiest pro-Israel Zionist apologists, racist figures, public figures that's out there supporting Israel.
Israel had my unconditional support before going there. Like, so, yeah. And then had to backtrack his Roger Waters appreciation for the same thing.
Now, by the way, the Roger Waters appreciation, but let's focus on Palestine for a minute. So anyway, so he went and he sat with this mega Zionist racist figure, and he was obviously given a piece of paper with points to remember, which he recited very poorly. And he got into issues that he had no business getting into, because there is any 3-year-old can fact check and realize that everything he said while sitting on that couch with this guy, with Shmuel Boteach, was absolutely refutable, very easily refutable. And it was lie after lie after lie after lie. Why he had to get into this, who knows? Somebody in his campaign, who I think should be fired, thought that this would support him and show that he's not an anti-Semite, which is complete nonsense, of course. So this is the reality in America. American politicians are I don't know, they've been bitten by some bug that they cannot let go of supporting Israel. They won't be weaned. Americans will not be weaned of this absurd disease, for lack of a better word, of supporting Israel. Why should Americans support Israel so much? What is it about this country that everybody seems to love so much? It's absolutely madness. And even there are other, I just posted another article, even other politicians that like to call themselves progressive, who are running. Well, some are running, some are not running, some are in Congress. They keep repeating the mantra of Israel as a democracy. Betty McCollum, who's been working tirelessly on this very important bill to protect Palestinian children from Israeli detention and torture. And she keeps saying that Israel is a democracy, Israel is a friend, Israel is a democracy. Well, if Israel is a democracy, why do we need a bill to support children from detention and torture?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. If it was a democracy, we wouldn't need her bill. But there you have it. This is some kind of a mantra that they're not willing to give up. And it's up to us as voters. It's up to us as consumers of the media, consumers of the news, to stand up and say, stop it. This is no longer acceptable. You can't do this anymore. When Bill Maher and Jordan Peterson and all these others interview the Israeli prime minister, you think they were interviewed. I don't know. Moses came down from the mountain. They all but kiss his feet.
Right.
They don't challenge him on his indictment, on his corruption. They don't challenge him on war crimes. They don't challenge him on the fact that he controls 7 million Palestinians without rights. We're not talking about a small population. We're talking about 7 million Palestinians that are governed by the state of Israel without rights. That's a big number. There are countries that are smaller than 7 million people, and nobody challenges him. When he comes to America, This is it. The president of the state of Israel came in and spoke before a joint session here in Congress. He got standing ovations and all that kind of stuff. Why was he allowed to land on U.S. soil anyway? He's a war criminal. He's the head of state of a country that's been accused by Amnesty International of committing a crime against humanity. The crime of apartheid is designated as a crime against humanity. And the president of that state gets to speak in front of a joint session of Congress. But America is I don't know, I know it's inflicted with this disease of loving Israel, and they won't let go. And I think it's a very serious problem.
Yeah, it is a serious, and we reported last.
What happened? Where did they go? What happened? Oh,
Community in Orlando, and then he turned his back on them just before, his election in order to ensure his election. So, we have even, obviously we know like the characters like Hakeem Jeffries and Richie Torres, who just blatantly proclaim themselves to be, pro-Israel, but then and then we
now
have
getting primaried by AIPAC lobby favorite, even though he's probably been super good to them. So
I know what you're probably going to say, but I'm going to ask this anyway. The two-state solution, that's kind of another talking point that politicians make. We want to work towards a two-state solution, in Palestine. Is that really realistic, or even like a one-state solution? Is that realistic?
Well, the two-state solution is a Zionist idea. It's a solution that will never take place, that is an impossibility. And Israel made sure it was an impossibility. And I'll explain why in a second. But it's very safe. So the more liberal, even progressives, quote unquote, politicians in America always fall back on the two-state solution. So we're pro two-state solution, which is safe. Number one, it's never going to happen. Number two, it's an impossibility. And number three, it doesn't solve any other problems, even if it was possible. Now, if we're talking about realistic solutions or realistic options for the question of Palestine, I see only two options. One option is the reality that we see today. It's an apartheid state. And this is what Israeli politicians have been calling for and acting on, from the very beginning. From their perspective, the Arabs, they don't say Palestinians, they say Arabs. The Arabs in the land of Israel, they call them the Arabs of Israel. They call Palestinians the Arabs of Israel. So they say the Arabs of Israel have three choices. They can remain and live quietly as residents with no rights. They can leave, or they can fight and die. That's it. The question of partitioning the land or dividing the land into two is completely, out of the question.
Right.
And it doesn't make sense anyway, because the country is small, and the two populations, even though the segregation is complete, geographically, they're very close to each other. Israelis and Palestinians sometimes live across the street from each other, even though albeit within this very, very effective segregation. Now, so that's one option, maintaining the apartheid state. And that's where America is going. That's where certainly Israel is going. And that's the one option. The other option, which I believe is the one we should fight for, is a free, democratic Palestine. So not an apartheid Palestine. And forget about dividing. It's all one country. It's all one state. Right now, it's all the apartheid state known as Israel. The fight that I believe all people of conscience should be part of is the fight to bring down the apartheid regime and replace it with a free, democratic Palestine. One person, one vote, and immediately put in place mechanisms that will allow the refugees to return. So the right of return is used a lot of times as kind of a bumper sticker, as kind of a headline. I'm not talking about it as a headline. I'm not talking about it theoretically. I'm talking about putting forward mechanisms that will make it possible for the refugees to actually come back and return. And so that is the other option. There is no third option. Those are two options. Zionism, the Zionist state, Zionism is a racist ideology, and it created an apartheid state, not surprisingly. The two go hand in hand. If we want to see freedom and justice and democracy, and I added this in that tweet that I mentioned earlier, democracy is only possible in Palestine, in a free Palestine, after Zionism falls, in a post-Zionist Palestine. When Zionism falls, when the apartheid state collapses and is replaced by a democratic system, which, by the way, has never existed, does not exist, then there will be a democracy in Palestine, and Israelis and Palestinians will live in a democracy.
What do you think the individual could do to reach that goal? You know, what's the next step for the people at home who want to support Palestine in this way? What do you think they should be doing?
Well, I think what people can do, first of all, is there's a call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Make sure now the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. People think, okay, so if I don't buy an avocado or an orange or whatever hummus from Israel, that's important. Don't get me wrong. But you can take it the next level. First of all, you can go to your local store and tell them to stop purchasing stuff from Israel and stop selling it because there's a call for boycott. Mm-hmm. But I was at a gathering, just a casual gathering here in Washington a few weeks ago, where kind of a social gathering, half the people there were going to Israel on a trip. You know, there are all these really fun trips that Israel or Zionist organizations here in the US, I think it's called a reality trip or something. It's for yuppies. It's for wealthy, young, professionals. They have a trip for chefs, and they have a trip for whatever else, and they have a trip for whatever else. I don't know. And don't go. Reject Israel. Reject Israel in your conversation. Reject Israel in your politics. Reject Israel when you travel. If you're going to go visit the country, and I believe people should go visit the country, they should go to visit as Palestine. Now, granted, the country is controlled by Israel, so when you land at the border, you go through Israeli passport control. Fine. But when you visit the country, you stay in Palestinian hotels, shop at Palestinian shops. Now, Palestinians exist throughout the entire country. People think that Palestinians only exist in the West Bank or in Gaza. Palestinians live throughout all of Palestine, from the very tip in the south to the very, very tip of the north and east to west. There's Palestinian cities, Palestinian communities, Palestinian everywhere. It's just that there's a segregation. And when you go on a trip with a tour guide or on a tour to Israel, you're not going to see any of that. So if you do go, and again, I encourage people to go, but I think it's a beautiful country, and it's important to go and support Palestinians. Call me or message me or message somebody else who's into Palestine, and I can give you references where to go and who to talk to and so on, and meet the Palestinians and meet the activists and see the incredible history and the archaeology and the culture that is Palestinian. Now that's a whole different story. So reject Israel, reject Zionism, and people will say, well, yes, but my son-in-law is Jewish. Or my best friend for 30, I've had a friend for 30 years and they're Jewish, so I don't want to bring it up. Bring it up. Why don't you want to bring it up? First of all, just because they're Jewish doesn't mean that they're racist and Zionist. And if they are racist, so if they're white supremacists, would you let them get away with it? Why do Zionists get a pass? If they're Zionists, if they support Israel, they are wrong. And it's important to point that out to them. And if you're willing to have a racist friend and not talk about it, okay, that's a personal decision. But I mean, that's how we change the story. And when your mayor or your chief of police or member of the school board gets invited to go to Israel, go to their office and tell them it is not acceptable. Any politicians, anybody who runs for any office, again, starting at school board, that claims that they support Israel should understand that they will not get your vote. Because if you support Israel, you support racism, and that's not acceptable. There should be zero tolerance to racism.
I agree. Collin, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so just as build upon that thought, like what, in your opinion, the role of independent media should be in terms of advocating for Palestine properly so that, more people are aware. And I just feel also at times that people say, oh, I want to learn more about Israel, but they never follow up with it necessarily, or they find the wrong people who kind of maybe inadvertently or not kind of share a pro-Israel sentiment with their audiences. So what do you say within independent media we should do practically to offer solidarity to the Palestinian community?
And if you could add any suggestions for media and in any form to follow, research, go look up on the subject, that would also be appreciated. Close this out.
Sure. I mean, this book that I wrote is a great primer. And the reason I say it's a great primer is because it's my journey as an Israeli into Palestine. So it's a lot easier for some people who are kind of confused and bothered, but and troubled, but don't really know how to deal with this issue. Going through this personal story of an Israeli and reaching and finding out why or how somebody like me goes from being this patriotic Zionist to being the guy that I am and speaking the way I do, it's a really good primer. And I know a lot of people that buy it for their friends. So if you have a friend who's struggling with the issue, and I know I'm promoting my own book, but I mean, I'm telling you, it's been seen as it's been used, and it works. And by the way, it just came out in a 10th anniversary edition, so it came out 3 times already. So it's so I strongly recommend starting with that. The General Sun, it's available everywhere. And then there's so many resources. Mondoweiss is a great resource. Electronic Intifada is a great resource. You have there's a great organization called Grassroots Jerusalem. It's a great resource. They have a lot of material, and it's political. Basically, they do political tours, but they also have a lot of media. These are great resources, and each one you go to will lead you to others,
right,
and to other people, to other books, to other material. And as independent media, I think it's important to be independent and to support the right cause. And again, I wouldn't call it solidarity. I don't think so. I think we're beyond the place where solidarity is enough. I think we all need to be part of the struggle. I don't see what I do as solidarity. I am participating with my Palestinian brothers and sisters in the struggle. Granted, we all have different roles within the struggle, but it's a struggle to free Palestine. It's a struggle for justice. Solidarity, I would equate solidarity with, you walk by, you see a person bleeding to death, and you throw them a Band-Aid, or you say, hang in there, brother. That's solidarity. Palestine is that. Palestine is the person who's bleeding to death. What they need is first aid. What they need is action. What Palestine needs is for all of us to participate, in Palestine. And so, this is how we participate. And when we call the country Israel, we're legitimizing the racism. We're legitimizing Zionism. The name of the country for 4,000 years, going back 4,000 years, until May 15th, 1948, was Palestine. There's a great book, I have it here maybe behind me somewhere, called Palestine, 4,000-Year History. Get it and read it. It's the authority. It's written by Nur Masalha, who's a very important Palestinian, well-known Palestinian historian. He goes back 4,000 years to show how that country, going back to the Pharaohs and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Greeks, always referred to that country as different versions of Palestine. Learn the history. Drop the biblical Zionist mythology, which is mythology, it's not history, and focus on the history. And I'll say one more thing. For us to be able to envision a free Palestine and the potential, the enormous potential of a free and democratic Palestine, we need to understand what the history of Palestine, a rich culture, a rich history, a rich economy, political systems, and the different groups within the country, the cuisine. I mean, everything. It's a very rich country in every way. In 1948, what the Israelis did, what the Zionists did, they claimed that they made the desert bloom. They stole the money. They stole the cities. They stole the equipment. They stole the produce on the trees. They stole a wealthy country. And then they said, well, it was just barren and we made it bloom, which is absurd because Europe was buying oranges and olive oil and soap and wheat and cotton and barley from Palestine. There was a rich economy of exporting all of these things to Europe, and they knew that it said Palestine on everything. Suddenly, May 15th, 1948, amnesia. Everybody forgot that they did business with Palestine. Look at any map under the sun up to that day. The country is called Palestine. So, it's important to be familiar with these things, to educate ourselves. After all, we as Americans give Israel almost $4 billion a year at a push of a button every January. $4 billion a year. And it's a rich country. It doesn't need foreign aid. It's a foreign aid bill. It doesn't need foreign aid. It's a very rich country. So at least you would think, let's educate ourselves and find out what the hell is going on. Why are we sending this rich country so much money? And why not? Is none of it going to Palestinians, by the way?
Right.
Who are the majority of the population?
Yep. Anything else?
Oh, no, I
think that's good.
Yeah. You kept it concise and tight. And we got through everything that we wanted to talk about with you today. But I think this is just a tip of the iceberg. I think we definitely need to have you on again. So I really appreciate you coming on, Miko. Before you leave, because I know you do have other arrangements, where can people find you, especially if they want to know more about you and the books that you've mentioned? Where can people find
they can go to mikopeled.com, and there's lists of books, and there's they can get my book, they can get other books. I have a podcast, Miko Peled Podcast. I've got stuff on Patreon as well. I've got a Patreon page. Some of the stuff is free, some of the stuff is, there's a $5 paywall or something. So I'm all over the place, and I'm all over social media as well. So I'm very easy to find and follow. Mikopeled.com has everything condensed pretty much, and so it's easy to find me and connect with me if people want to, or just follow me and listen to the things I say and read the things I write.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Well, Miko,
Yep.
Absolutely, guys. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We should do this again. But anyway, I think that's it for us. As always, kids, remember, labels are bad. Stay independent. Good night, fam.